Elijah Turner had spent decades building his company from the ground up. As the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech firm, he had earned his success through hard work, intelligence, and perseverance. But on this particular flight, none of that seemed to matter. As he settled into his first-class seat, enjoying a rare moment of peace before a crucial business deal, an entitled white passenger marched over to him with a scowl. Moments later, a flight attendant leaned in and, with an icy tone, said something that made his blood run cold. "Sir, you'll need to move to economy. This seat isn't for you." Elijah stared at her in disbelief. He had paid for this seat, just like every other first-class passenger. But the crew had made their decision. He didn't belong. What they didn't know, they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. Have you ever seen unfair treatment in real life? Let us know in the comments. And if you love stories about justice and standing up for what's right, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Elijah Turner didn't move. He sat in his first-class seat, his fingers resting on the armrest, his mind replaying the flight attendant's words. "This seat isn't for you." He had worked too hard and overcome too many challenges to be told, at this stage in his life, that he didn't belong somewhere he had every right to be. Elijah was a 48-year-old self-made billionaire. He had started with nothing, growing up in a struggling household where luxuries like flying first class were just a dream. But he had built one of the most successful tech companies in the world. His name was known in boardrooms, on Wall Street, and in tech summits across the globe. Yet here he was, being asked to move as if his success, his money, and his accomplishments didn't matter. The flight attendant, Susan Mitchell, stood stiffly by his seat, arms crossed, her expression impatient. She was a woman in her late 40s, the type who believed in power through authority. In her mind, some people deserved special treatment more than others. And Elijah? He clearly didn't fit the profile of someone she believed belonged in first class. A man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit, stood just a few feet away, glaring at Elijah like he was an inconvenience. His name was Richard Carlson, a wealthy investor who had grown accustomed to getting what he wanted. And right now, he wanted Elijah's seat. Richard let out an exaggerated sigh. "Look, let's not make a big deal out of this. Just switch seats, and we can all move on." Elijah turned his gaze toward him, calm but firm. "I'm not moving." Susan huffed, shifting her weight. "Sir, Mr. Carlson is a frequent flyer with us. We'd like to accommodate him with this seat." Elijah kept his voice steady. "So am I. And I paid for this seat." A few nearby first-class passengers started to take notice. Some exchanged glances, sensing something was off. Others looked down, not wanting to get involved. Outside the windows, the airport runway stretched into the distance. The plane was minutes from departure. Yet the tension inside the cabin was rising. A young flight attendant, Amanda, lingered near the galley, clearly uncomfortable. She knew Elijah was being treated unfairly, but Susan was her superior. Elijah sat back, his patience wearing thin. "Sir," Susan pressed, her voice sharp, "I'm going to have to ask you one last time. Please move to economy, or we'll have to involve security." Elijah slowly turned his head to look at her, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled out his phone and started dialing. Susan frowned. "Who are you calling?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He placed the phone against his ear and spoke calmly, yet with authority. "This flight crew is about to make the biggest mistake of their careers." Susan blinked, caught off guard. And that's when everything started to unravel. Elijah Turner held the phone to his ear, his expression unreadable. Susan Mitchell, the lead flight attendant, shifted uncomfortably, her patience clearly wearing thin. She had expected this man to comply, to move without question. But now he was making a call? To whom? Richard Carlson, the entitled passenger still standing near Elijah's seat, let out a frustrated sigh. Is this really necessary? Just move, and let's get on with it. Elijah ignored him. The phone rang twice before a deep, commanding voice answered on the other end. "Mr. Turner?" Elijah's voice remained calm but firm. "We have a situation. I need you to handle it immediately." Susan frowned, crossing her arms. "Sir, we need to prepare for takeoff. You're causing a delay." Elijah slowly lowered his phone, locking eyes with her. "Number, you're causing the delay." The flight crew stiffened. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. The tension was palpable. Susan clenched her jaw. "Sir, if you don't move, I'll have to call security." Elijah raised a brow. "You should probably do that. In fact, I insist." Susan's confidence wavered. She glanced at Amanda, the younger flight attendant who had been watching nervously from the side. Amanda looked away quickly, clearly torn between following orders and acknowledging the obvious injustice. Just then, the intercom crackled to life. "Elijah Turner, please report to the front of the cabin immediately." Richard smirked, adjusting his suit. "Finally, someone's handling this." Elijah stood up, adjusting his tailored jacket, and calmly grabbed his carry-on. Susan exhaled in relief, assuming she had won. But Elijah wasn't heading to economy. He walked straight past Susan, past Richard, past the first-class cabin, toward the cockpit. Amanda's eyes widened in realization. Some passengers craned their necks, watching in curious silence. Susan frowned in confusion. "Where does he think he's going?" she muttered under her breath. A minute later, the cockpit door opened and a tall man in a navy blue suit stepped out, followed by the airline manager. The man's face was calm but serious. "Elijah," the man greeted. Elijah shook his hand. "Good to see you, James." The airline manager's expression was unreadable as he turned to the crew. "We have a problem." Susan froze. She suddenly recognized the name, James Lively, the regional director of the airline. The passengers watched in silence as James folded his arms and addressed the crew. "I received a call from Mr. Turner regarding a situation." He paused, his gaze flicking to Susan and Richard. "And I need an explanation." Susan swallowed hard. "Sir, this passenger, Mr. Turner, was occupying a seat we needed to reassign." James raised an eyebrow. "Needed to reassign? To whom?" Susan shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Carlson is a loyal first-class member, and we wanted to ensure he had a comfortable experience." Elijah's expression remained unreadable. He let the silence hang in the air, watching as the reality of the situation slowly set in. James turned toward Richard, his expression stern. "Sir, did you request Mr. Turner's seat?" Richard scoffed. "I assumed there was a mix-up. I fly first class all the time, and I didn't expect—" He stopped himself, but it was already too late. The implication was clear. Susan looked down, realizing she had severely miscalculated. James took a slow breath, then turned back to Susan. "Let me get this straight. You attempted to remove a VIP passenger from first class, based solely on an assumption." Susan's face flushed. I didn't know he was VIP." James tilted his head. "Did you check?" Silence. Amanda's gaze dropped to the floor. The weight of the moment settled over the cabin. Passengers who had remained silent before now exchanged glances, some whispering, some shaking their heads. Finally, Elijah spoke. "You didn't check because you didn't think you had to." Susan's lips parted, as if she wanted to protest. But she had no defense. James exhaled sharply and turned toward the waiting passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. This matter will be handled immediately." He turned back to Susan, his expression icy. "You and your crew will report to my office after this flight. We have serious issues to discuss." Susan's breath hitched. Elijah picked up his carry-on and returned to his seat. As he settled in, Richard stood frozen in place, his entitlement melting into embarrassment. The whispers in the cabin grew louder. Susan and her crew had made a grave mistake. And now, there would be consequences. Elijah Turner settled back into his first-class seat, adjusting his suit jacket with deliberate calm. The cabin was dead silent. Richard Carlson, the entitled passenger, had slumped into a nearby seat, his face a shade paler than before. Passengers whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Elijah and Susan, the flight attendant who had just been exposed for her blatant bias. Susan Mitchell stood rigid, her fingers clenched into fists at her sides. Just minutes ago, she had been so sure of her authority, so certain that she was in control of the situation. Now she was exposed, humiliated, and unsure of what would happen next. James Lively, the regional director of the airline, was still standing at the front of the cabin, his face unreadable. He had just ordered Susan and her crew to report to his office after the flight. But the confrontation wasn't over yet. James turned to Elijah, his voice firm but respectful. "Mr. Turner, again, I deeply apologize for this situation. This is unacceptable." Elijah met his gaze and nodded slightly. "I appreciate that, but apologies don't undo the damage." James sighed, glancing toward the crew. "That's why there will be immediate consequences." Susan's breath caught in her throat. "Sir, please." James raised a hand, silencing her. "Number, this is not a discussion. You and your team made a disgraceful decision, one that goes against every standard of service and professionalism we uphold in this airline." Susan opened her mouth, searching for an excuse, but no words came. What could she say? That she had ignored protocol because she didn't think Elijah belonged in first class? That she had prioritized a white passenger based on an assumption? Richard shifted in his seat, suddenly uncomfortable. He had thought he was going to be the winner in this situation, but now he was nothing more than an embarrassed bystander. James folded his arms. "Let's be very clear. Mr. Turner isn't just a first-class passenger. He isn't just a VIP. He is one of the airline's largest corporate investors." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Susan's face drained of color. Richard looked like he wanted to disappear. Amanda, the younger flight attendant, covered her mouth, her eyes wide. "You didn't just insult a paying customer," James continued, his voice filled with controlled anger. "You insulted someone who has the power to change the course of this airline." Susan staggered backward slightly. I didn't know." Elijah finally spoke, his voice calm but piercing. "You didn't think you had to." Susan's head snapped toward him, but she had no defense. "You didn't check my ticket. You didn't confirm my status. You made a judgment call based on your own bias." Elijah's voice was steady, measured, but filled with quiet intensity. "You assumed that I didn't belong here." Susan opened her mouth again, then closed it. James exhaled sharply. "Mr. Turner, as of now, Susan Mitchell and the rest of this flight crew are suspended pending further investigation." Susan let out a small, strangled gasp. "Sir, please." "No," James interrupted. "There's nothing you can say to justify what you did." Passengers in the first-class cabin began murmuring again, shaking their heads. Some even glared at Susan, disgusted by what they had just witnessed. James turned toward Richard Carlson. "And as for you, sir," Richard stiffened. Look, I didn't mean any harm. I just thought—" James cut him off. "I don't care what you thought. You took a part in this, and I can assure you our airline will no longer welcome your business." Richard froze. "Wait, what?" James gave him a cold stare. "Your elite status with our airline, revoked, effective immediately." Richard's jaw dropped. "You can't do that." "Oh, we can," James said flatly, "and we just did." More gasps filled the cabin. A few passengers even clapped quietly. Richard's face burned with embarrassment. He turned to Susan, expecting her to say something in his defense, but she stared at the floor, defeated. Elijah finally leaned forward, folding his hands together. "This isn't just about one flight," he said, his voice low but powerful. "This is about an entire system that allows people like me to be treated as less than, no matter what we've achieved." James nodded, his expression grim. "And that's why changes will be made. Starting today." Susan let out a shaky breath, her career flashing before her eyes. Elijah glanced at Amanda, the young flight attendant who had witnessed everything but had been too afraid to speak up. "You knew this was wrong," he said, his tone slightly softer. "Didn't you?" Amanda's eyes welled with tears. "Yes," she admitted. "I should have said something. I was scared." Elijah nodded. "I understand that, but next time." His gaze was steady. "You need to speak up." Amanda swallowed hard, then nodded. "I will." James turned to the rest of the crew. "You all have 1 hour after we land to clear out your things. A new crew will take over for the return flight." Susan's hands shook. "Please, sir." James's expression hardened. "You made your choice, Susan. Now you live with it." With that, James turned back to Elijah and extended a hand. "Mr. Turner, we can't undo what happened today. But I promise you, this will never happen again." Elijah shook his hand. "I'll hold you to that." As the flight resumed and the tension began to settle, Susan and Richard sat in absolute silence. They had walked onto this plane thinking they were untouchable. Now, they had lost everything. As the plane cruised through the sky, the weight of what had just happened still lingered in the first-class cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, some whispering about the shocking events, others silently reflecting on what they had just witnessed. Elijah Turner sat back in his seat, his fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. He had experienced discrimination before, but this had been an open, unapologetic attempt to strip him of his dignity. And the worst part, it wasn't even surprising. Across the aisle, Susan Mitchell, the now suspended flight attendant, sat stiffly in a jump seat, her face pale. Her hands trembled as she gripped her lap. She wasn't used to losing control. Just an hour ago, she had been issuing commands, making assumptions, and wielding her authority over someone she thought she could walk over. Now, she had no authority left. Next to her, Richard Carlson sat in utter silence. The smug confidence he had once carried was gone. He had lost his elite flyer status, been publicly humiliated, and was now facing potential consequences beyond this flight. But the real shock was still coming. The flight had just passed its halfway point when James Lively, the airline's regional director, received a call. He excused himself and stepped into a private area near the galley. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was calm but direct. "James, it's about the situation on Flight 317. James immediately straightened. "Yes, sir. It's been handled. The crew involved has been suspended pending further review." There was a brief pause. Then the voice responded. "That's not enough." James blinked. "Excuse me?" "We've been reviewing the incident closely," the voice continued. "There's no pending review. The entire crew, including Mitchell, is officially terminated, effective immediately." James's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just disciplinary action. This was corporate-level fallout. "And one more thing," the voice added. "Mr. Turner isn't just a passenger. He's been a silent partner in this airline for years." James's mouth went dry. He had known Elijah was important, but not this important. "This is coming from the board," the voice finished. "Once the flight lands, the crew will be escorted out. and security will ensure their immediate removal. Make sure Mr. Turner knows he has our full backing." James hung up the phone, stunned. A few moments later, James walked back into the first-class cabin, his face unreadable. He approached Elijah's seat and leaned down slightly. "Elijah," he said, his voice lower now, "I just got off the phone with corporate. The entire crew, including Susan, has been officially terminated." Susan's head snapped up. What? James turned toward her, his face stern. "You are no longer employed by this airline. Once we land, you'll be escorted off the premises." Susan's breath hitched. She turned to Elijah as if looking for a way to justify herself. "Mr. Turner, please, I wasn't trying to—" Elijah held up a hand. His voice was calm but firm. "You weren't trying to what, Susan? Discriminate? Demean me? Strip me of my dignity?" Susan shook her head rapidly. I thought—" Elijah let out a slow breath. "No, Susan. You didn't think." She looked down, unable to respond. Richard, who had been quiet this entire time, suddenly sat up. "Look, this is ridiculous. Firing the entire crew over a misunderstanding? That's extreme." James glanced at him, unimpressed. "Oh, you're still talking?" A few passengers chuckled quietly. Richard glared. "I'm a respected businessman, and I won't be treated like some criminal." Elijah finally turned his head to face him. "Respected businessmen don't demand special treatment at the expense of others. They don't assume people don't belong based on how they look, and they don't get away with behavior like this anymore." Richard's face burned with embarrassment. James crossed his arms. "And just to be clear, Mr. Carlson, you are now permanently banned from flying with our airline." Richard's mouth fell open. "You can't do that." James simply shrugged. "Oh, we can. And we just did." Susan buried her face in her hands, while Richard stared blankly ahead, defeated. Elijah simply leaned back in his seat, watching everything unfold. He had come onto this flight expecting a quiet trip. Instead, he had exposed a toxic culture within the airline. But now, things were finally changing. Elijah Turner gazed out the window, the clouds stretching endlessly in the sky. Just hours ago, he had boarded this flight expecting nothing more than a peaceful journey. Instead, he had been humiliated, underestimated, and forced to defend his right to a seat he had paid for. Now, the entire crew was fired. The airline had taken swift action, ensuring that this kind of discrimination would not be tolerated. Richard Carlson, the entitled passenger who had demanded his seat, had been permanently banned. Yet, as Elijah sat there, he didn't feel victorious. He felt tired. How many times had he been in a situation like this? How many times had he been dismissed, ignored, or forced to fight for respect? He closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling deeply. Then, James Lively, the airline's regional director, approached his seat once again. His tone was more formal now, more measured. "Elijah, I know an apology won't undo what happened today, but I want you to know that we are committed to making things right," he said. "Not just for you, but for every passenger who has ever been treated unfairly." Elijah nodded, appreciating the sentiment, but knowing words alone weren't enough. "Good," he replied simply, "because this isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows people like Susan to act on their biases without thinking twice." James sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I agree. That's why corporate has just approved a mandatory anti-discrimination training program for all airline staff, flight attendants, gate agents, even executives." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Training isn't enough." James hesitated. "I know. That's why I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to be part of the change. We'd like you to work with us. help us rebuild trust, set new policies, and hold people accountable. Elijah studied him for a moment. He could tell that James was serious. This wasn't just damage control. This was an attempt at real change. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll do it. But I have conditions." James smirked. "I figured you would." Elijah leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "First, I want full transparency. I want the results of this training made public. No sweeping this under the rug." James nodded. "Agreed." "Second," Elijah continued, "I want a zero-tolerance policy for racial discrimination. If this happens again, there will be immediate consequences. No investigation pending excuses." James didn't hesitate. "Done." Elijah leaned back. "And lastly, I want a mentorship program for underrepresented pilots and airline staff. If we're going to fix this, we need to make sure people from all backgrounds have the opportunity to lead." James exhaled, processing the request. Then he nodded. "I'll push it through." Elijah finally felt something shift. This wasn't just reactionary policy changes. This was real, structural improvement. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Susan still sat in shock. Her career had just crumbled in front of her. And for the first time, she seemed to realize why. As the plane began its descent, Susan stood up hesitantly and made her way toward Elijah's seat. James watched carefully, ready to step in if needed. Susan's hands trembled slightly as she swallowed her pride. "Mr. Turner, I just wanted to say I was wrong." Elijah looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "I made an assumption," she continued, "and I didn't even think twice about it. I didn't check your ticket. I didn't ask questions. I just assumed I knew who deserved to be in first class." She let out a shaky breath. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to tell you that I see it now, and I'm sorry." For a moment, Elijah said nothing. Then he sighed. "Susan, regret is a powerful thing, but change is more important." Susan nodded quickly. "I know, and I want to change. I just don't know where to start." Elijah studied her for a long moment. Then he pulled out a business card and held it out to her. She frowned in confusion. "What is this?" "A starting point," Elijah said simply. "If you really mean what you just said, you'll call the number on that card. They run diversity and inclusion programs for professionals who want to unlearn their biases. If you're serious, you'll take the first step." Susan stared at the card in her shaking hands. She had expected anger, humiliation, retaliation, but instead, Elijah was giving her a chance to learn. Tears welled in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Elijah nodded once. "We'll see if you mean it." When the flight landed, Elijah walked through the terminal with renewed purpose. The injustice he had faced had turned into a movement for change. By the time he reached the exit, his phone buzzed. A message from corporate leadership. "We've reviewed your conditions. Everything is approved. The airline will announce the new policies tomorrow. Thank you for holding us accountable." Elijah allowed himself a small smile. Today hadn't just been about one incident. It had been about shifting an entire industry toward fairness, respect, and accountability. And he wasn't done yet. As Elijah Turner stepped out of the airport, he felt the weight of the day lift just slightly. He had boarded the flight expecting a simple trip, but it had turned into a moment of reckoning. This wasn't just about one flight crew or one entitled passenger. It was about a system that had allowed bias to go unchecked for too long. But today, that system had been challenged, and real change was happening. The airline had fired those responsible, committed to industry-wide reforms, and agreed to implement diversity initiatives that would ensure equal treatment for all passengers. And Susan, she had been given an opportunity to reflect, to grow, and to unlearn her prejudice. Whether or not she took it was her choice. Elijah glanced at his phone one last time, rereading the message from corporate. "Thank you for holding us accountable." He smiled slightly. That was what mattered most. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly? What did you do? Would you have spoken up in a situation like this? Or would you have stayed silent? Let's talk about it in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, fairness, and accountability, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more powerful real-life stories. Because real change starts with all of us. Thank you for watching. Stay aware, stand strong, and never be afraid to demand respect.